Something big is happening in Senegal. President Faye Diomaye might be pulling off one of the boldest political moves in West Africa, and it could send shockwaves all the way to France. Is he following in the footsteps of Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré? It's starting to look that way. Since taking office, Faye has played it carefully, asking for a redefinition of Senegal's relationship with France, not a breakup. Remember his 2024 trip to Paris? He called for stronger collaboration. But now, something's changed. The tone is sharper, more decisive. Faye's no longer asking. He's acting. A few weeks ago, Senegal started renaming streets and public spaces across Dakar. Sounds small, right? But don't be fooled. This move hits at the very foundation of post-colonial identity. See, when the French colonized Senegal, they didn't just take land and resources, they tried to erase the culture. And even decades after independence, the scars are still visible. How? Just walk through the capital. You'll see roads, buildings, and landmarks still carrying the names of French governors, generals, and officials, many of whom led brutal colonial campaigns and looked down on Africans. A 2019 study found that nearly 60% of Dakar's public spaces still carry French names. 65 years after independence, Charles de Gaulle's name still sits proudly on a major boulevard. The same Charles de Gaulle who created France-Afrique, a system designed to keep former colonies dependent on France. That system gave France first access to African minerals, control over African armies, and influence over currencies. And yet, we still name our streets after him. People in Senegal are starting to say, enough is enough. Mata Sek, a meat vendor in Dakar, put it plainly. Why are our landmarks still named after colonizers? I've been to Italy, to France. You don't see monuments there named after Africans. And he's right. Senegal has its own heroes. Singers like Youssou N'Dour, warriors like Lat Dior, scholars, resistance leaders, yet they've been pushed aside in favor of foreign names. That's not just disrespect, it's erasure. President Faye is now rewriting that story. In December 2024, he launched a new initiative to take back Senegal's historical identity. He appointed Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko to lead the National Council for Memory and Historical Heritage. The goal? Rename streets, squares, and schools to honor Senegalese icons. But that's not all. He's going straight into the classroom. Senegal is now working on overhauling its education system, especially history books, because for decades, students have been taught a version of history that glorifies colonizers and sidelines African achievements. In some cases, entire African history books have disappeared from schools. They were replaced by European narratives that tell African kids their ancestors were nothing before colonization. That's changing. Urban planner Rakia Dialofo says this moment is about more than renaming places. It's about healing from centuries of trauma. She points to Senegal's role in the transatlantic slave trade, the psychological scars of colonization, and the need for national pride. This is about letting Senegalese kids grow up knowing that their history didn't start with slavery. It started with greatness. And then came the big one. In November 2024, just weeks before the 80th anniversary of the Traoré massacre, Faye's government announced Senegal will no longer host French military bases. That's a massive break from tradition. For decades, France had boots on the ground in Senegal, and no one questioned it. But not anymore. That massacre, it's one of the darkest chapters in Franco-African history. In 1944, hundreds of West African soldiers, many from Senegal, returned home after fighting for France in World War II. They expected to be paid and honored. Instead, they were betrayed. When they demanded their back pay, the French army opened fire on them. Official reports said 24 were killed, but unofficially, it could be up to 300. Survivors were imprisoned, their stories buried, and for decades, the massacre was left out of textbooks. Even a 1988 film about it, Camp de Traoré, was banned in France and censored in Senegal. Only now, with leaders like Faye in power and France losing its grip on West Africa, is the truth finally getting the spotlight. Even French President Emmanuel Macron was forced to acknowledge the massacre. But let's be real. That apology only came because African countries are speaking louder, standing taller, and refusing to be silent anymore. What Faye is doing isn't just politics, it's a cultural revolution. From renaming streets and rewriting textbooks to removing military bases, he's reclaiming Senegal's story. And if he succeeds, it could inspire a ripple effect across all of Francophone Africa. The big question now is, will France try to stop it? Or is this the moment West Africa finally walks its own path, free from old chains? If you're feeling this shift, if you believe in reclaiming identity and rewriting history, hit that subscribe button. Because this is just the beginning. It took 8 decades and mounting pressure from African nations before France finally acknowledged its colonial wrongdoings. President Faye of Senegal welcomed President Macron's recognition, but he didn't let France off the hook. To Faye, apologies mean little when foreign troops still operate on Senegalese soil, hosting French military bases while trying to make amends for the past. That contradiction doesn't sit right. Faye made his position clear. Real independence isn't just about rewriting history books or flying your own flag. It's about owning your land, your decisions, and your military. And when asked directly about France's continued military presence, he didn't sugarcoat it. He pointed to history. France enslaved Africans, colonized them, and even after independence, never truly left. Then he flipped the script. Can you imagine Senegal having a military base in Paris, or China, or Russia doing the same? Exactly. The answer is obvious. In a bold interview from the presidential palace, Faye stated what many have felt for years. Senegal is a sovereign nation, and genuine sovereignty doesn't come with foreign soldiers stationed in your country. Period. But don't mistake this stance for isolationism. Faye isn't cutting France off entirely. Unlike some of Senegal's neighbors, he made it clear this isn't about burning bridges, it's about balance. In fact, he pointed out that China is currently Senegal's largest economic partner, with massive investments and trade deals, yet not a single Chinese military base exists in the country. Faye posed the question himself. Does that mean our relationship with China is broken? Absolutely not. For decades, France has maintained a force of around 350 troops in Senegal. But under Faye's leadership, that chapter is coming to a close. Those soldiers are packing up. Quick note, if you're into bold leadership and major shifts in Africa, make sure to like this video, drop a comment, and hit subscribe so you don't miss future updates. Back to it. By February 2025, Senegal and France had officially agreed on the timeline for the troop withdrawal. Both nations issued a joint statement announcing the formation of a dedicated commission to oversee the exit and transfer of military facilities. But that wasn't all. They also unveiled plans for a revamped security partnership, one that respects Senegal's sovereignty and reflects mutual interests moving forward. Senegal's move places it squarely in line with a larger wave sweeping across West Africa. Countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have already ousted French forces and begun removing colonial symbols. Burkina Faso, for example, recently renamed a prominent boulevard in Ouagadougou, once called Boulevard Charles de Gaulle, named after a symbol of French colonial legacy. The street now honors Thomas Sankara, the beloved revolutionary and Pan-Africanist leader assassinated in 1987. The renaming wasn't just a formality. It took place during a powerful memorial event marking 36 years since Sankara's death. President Ibrahim Traoré laid the foundation stone for a new mausoleum in his name and delivered a heartfelt speech, calling Sankara a visionary who still inspires Africans to pursue complete freedom and self-rule. That same spirit continues through other initiatives. Retired Colonel Major Dawda Traoré, Vice President of the International Thomas Sankara Memorial Committee, recently applauded the country's leadership for their symbolic stand. But he didn't stop there. Just a few months ago, he announced a major cultural shift. Burkina Faso is changing its national anthem. The former English-language version is being rewritten and sung in 14 native languages. This effort, according to the Ministry of National Education, is part of a broader mission to reignite national pride and strip away the colonial mindset. It's bold, it's timely, and it's deeply symbolic. Military leaders across the Sahel are now unified in a clear goal: to break free from colonial influence. Not just through military independence, but through cultural transformation too. And that brings us to the deeper reason this matters. When colonial powers first landed in Africa, their conquest wasn't just physical, it was psychological. They didn't only seize territory, they dismantled identities. Step 1. Convince Africans their languages, traditions, and beliefs were backward. Step 2. Replace them with European models, especially in education and language. French, Portuguese, English, it didn't matter. What mattered was controlling thought. And that control began with speech. So they built schools, brought missionaries, and pushed Western values, not to develop African minds, but to mold them into loyal, submissive subjects. These institutions weren't built to fuel innovation or build African futures. They were meant to erase the past and rewrite the narrative. Colonial-era education systems were never meant to empower Africans. They were designed to control, teaching just enough to keep people obedient, but not enough to spark innovation or challenge the system. Sadly, many schools across Africa still carry that legacy. They're heavy on outdated theory, light on practical skills. They elevate foreign histories while sidelining local cultures and languages. And that gap has had real consequences. If African education had focused on building self-reliance from the start, the road to independence might have come sooner than the 1960s. The real push for liberation only gained traction after African soldiers fought in World War II and realized, through global exposure, that true freedom was possible. But even today, many students are taught to admire the West while neglecting their own heritage. Their native languages, traditions, and achievements are barely acknowledged, let alone celebrated. Now, though, that tide is turning. Moves like Burkina Faso translating its national anthem into local languages mark a wider cultural revival. But this isn't just about lyrics. It's about reclaiming identity, pride, and the power to define one's own future. Consider this. Most African countries have 10 or more indigenous languages. Nigeria alone has over 250, each tied to a rich cultural legacy. Pre-colonial Africa wasn't just a collection of scattered tribes, it was a continent full of kingdoms and civilizations with their own laws, trade systems, and leadership structures. Yes, they had their conflicts, just like medieval Europe, but they also had balance and order. Then colonizers came and redrew maps without understanding or respecting the communities on the ground. Entirely different groups were bundled into new nations with artificial borders. That decision still haunts Africa today. Many of the continent's current tensions and insecurities stem from these forced unions, where long-standing ethnic differences are now political fault lines. Take Mali. The Tuareg rebellion in 2013 started as a plea for recognition, but it spiraled into chaos, exploited by extremist groups across the Sahel. In Nigeria, power has long been concentrated in just a few ethnic hands, mainly Hausa and Yoruba, leaving many minority communities sidelined. That imbalance continues to breed division and instability. All of it, at its core, traces back to a loss of identity. When people are stripped of their language, disconnected from their culture, and made to live under systems that ignore their realities, resentment builds. Without unity grounded in shared heritage, progress remains out of reach. So what's the way forward? Africa must look inward, rediscover its roots, rebuild from a foundation of local culture, language, and indigenous wisdom. Because without identity, true development is impossible. Growth must come from within. Just look at other regions. Germany speaks German. China uses Mandarin. India has Hindi and many regional languages. Despite their diversity, these nations rally around their own tongues. Meanwhile, most African countries still use the languages of their former rulers, English, French, Portuguese, as official languages. These aren't neutral choices. They're constant reminders of colonization. Worse still, many African schools treat local languages as inferior. Speaking them can get students punished. Some young people today can't even speak their parents' language, only that of their colonizers. That's how deep this mindset runs. But change is underway. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso is leading by example. He didn't just translate the national anthem, he made sure it's taught in schools across 14 local languages. It's about reconnecting the youth to their identity and heritage. Other countries are following suit. In Côte d'Ivoire, streets once named after French presidents now honor national figures like Félix Houphouët-Boigny. In Dakar, when Ousmane Sonko became mayor of a district, he renamed Charles de Gaulle Avenue to Peace Street and removed other colonial markers, replacing them with names that reflect Senegal's own story. Tanzania is doing the same in Dar es Salaam, reclaiming its urban landscape to honor local leaders instead of foreign ones. These changes might seem symbolic, but they're powerful. They're part of a continent-wide movement to decolonize African minds, spaces, and systems. Africa isn't completely free yet, but with every renamed street, reimagined anthem, and reclaimed tradition, it's getting closer. So here's the big question. When will Africa fully reclaim its voice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this message speaks to you, hit that like button, share the video, and subscribe to stay plugged into Africa's rise.